Hello, we will start talking about Chapter 1, Human Violence and Individual Changes, how we define it and how we measure it. We'll look at some terms, the difference between reported and unreported crime, what kind of effects it has, the term fear of crime, which everybody should know, and what causes crime. We also look at dynamics. Many people use this term in psychology, but few people tell you what it is. It means interpersonal factors. So to begin, definitions. Human violent crime is interpersonal between two or more people, and it can happen anywhere. Public, private, domestic meaning personal, public meaning out in the community, even in privately owned corporations. There are many types, which we will talk about in future, in the different sections of the chapters, which are broken up as school violence, workplace violence, and so on. To talk about fear and effects of violent crime, we are going to look at some research results. If you don't know what a Gallup poll is, traditionally during dinner time or late afternoon, they call your landline number and ask you questionnaires for a survey interview. In 2006, the majority, 60%, of respondents reported that they thought that crime rates were increasing compared to last year annually. 54% of Black people, 47% of white people worried from occasionally to frequently about home burglary when they're away, which is very common if you're on a trip, worrying about the security of your house. Now we will talk about a paradox called fear of crime. Women and elderly, not surprisingly, have greater fear of crime compared to young and men. However, in actual victimization rates, women and elderly have less victimization, and we'll talk about what that is in a second. Factors related to fear of crime include socioeconomic status. If you are from the low socioeconomic status bracket, you will have double the rate of fear of crime as people in high socioeconomic status, SES. According to sex differences, women have double the rate of fear of crime as men do for walking alone at night, even in their own neighborhood. Perceptions are not the same thing as reality, and the people who have the most fear of crime are least victimized. One example that comes to mind is when I was an undergraduate living in a dormitory suite at the University of California, San Diego. The girl who had the room next to me would always say peculiar things in the morning. She would complain about not being able to urinate, sometimes for 6 hours. And I found out at the end of that stay that she had been, due to fear of crime being high, moving and barring her dormitory door with her bed. She would push her bed against her door. In her perceptions, this prevented people from being able to break and enter. So people with high fear of crime have perceptions that make them act conservatively. They might not walk alone at night and so on, and this decreases the likelihood of their actual real victimization rates in violent crime. So it's called a paradox. Who is fearful and who should be fearful are not the same. What causes people to be violent? Individual influence, familiar influence, community influence, and we will talk about each of these now. You have all these handouts, and feel free to email or ask me questions, as we go along. These are available in your website. These influences are not mutually exclusive. Someone with genes toward violence might join a gang, and in that community disorder and violence have an overlap between factors of individual influence and community influence. If we had to pick, research results indicate that individual influence and familial influence have the greatest impact on increasing our risk for becoming violent ourselves. And if we think about it, it makes sense. Genes we can't help but deal with in biopsychosocial ways, biology, psychology, and sociology, which social, which is how psychology frames looking at incidents theoretically. We'll look at all those factors. Individually, we can't help but have the genes we have. And as far as familial influence goes, family would be the people we spend the most amount of time with in our influential years, when we're very impressionable, when we do what we're told and follow instructions. When we're young, who do we spend the most time with? It would be our family, so they would have influence. We like to think of family as buffers who keep us safe and cushioned from the external influences that might be negative, but in certain cases that's not true, and we'll talk about that in a second. So to start with individual influence, this could be our very genetic code. They have found over 13 enzymes and genetic influences, one of which is the monoamine oxidase type A allele, A-L-L-E-L-E. It means a part of a chromosome. In this case, if your MAO type A is too short compared to the average length on a chromosome, you have irregular hormone, well, some of them are hormones, but commonly known as neurotransmitters, serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. These help you with happiness and movement. And in this case, you have abnormal levels because this short allele, MAO type A, is making you not regulate those brain chemicals properly. One example might be serotonin flooding. So most people learn through cost avoidance, gain reward. So if you treat people with respect, you gain friends. So you do that. You get rewards, so you keep getting the gain by acting appropriately. The cost is if you hit people, you lose friends. So you avoid hitting people so that you don't lose friends. This cost avoidance is not socially learned appropriately with people who have a short MAO type A genetic endowment. This is because they have serotonin flooding. So happy, happy, joy, joy. They step on someone's toes, happy, happy, joy, joy. This person screams in pain, happy, happy, joy, joy. They have too much serotonin, so they're just happy, happy, joy, joy. And they don't learn social skills this way. It is actually misnamed. It's called warrior gene in common speak, and even professionally used sometimes, but it's actually not quite a gene, it's an allele. Other things can be environmental. In the old days, children used to sneak under the porch or patio, and because we didn't have security lids for paint cans, they would lick or eat paint and immediately get brain damage. And this increases impulsivity, poor decision making, and so on, possibly. So that could contribute to hostility. Birth trauma as another environmental biological factor. If you don't know what a forceps is, forceps in medical speak made out of surgical steel, you might think of salad tongs. They're steel, made to look like a V, and it loops and makes a little square kind of a loop at the ends. And this helps you pick things up. In the old days, medical doctors, physicians, not psychologists, used to use these types of mechanisms to help birth delivery, they would think. So when a woman was in labor, they would use this to pluck the baby out. Unfortunately, when babies are born, the 3 layers of their skull are soft. If you've ever seen a Chihuahua, the Fornix, the Molera, sometimes they have a soft spot and it never fully gets hard and solidified. Babies have a soft spot up here. All of us did. And this helps Mother Nature's genius of minimizing pain and harm to the mother and the fetus. At this point, when the baby comes out and you are squishing, squeezing, plucking the brain and the skull, you can cause brain damage. And so medical doctors didn't know why children were having learning disorders, brain damage. It didn't run in the family. And they finally, kind of relatively recently, more recent than not, decided that that was why. What they were doing is called a birth trauma. They don't do that anymore. Familial influence means the parents, even older siblings, younger siblings. At any rate, one example of familial influence that increases probability of violence in the child might be parental violence. So this would be violence between the parents. If the child sees it or hears it, just witnessing it in another room through being exposed to violent sounds could actually cause dysfunction in the child. The child might not have a baseline or a reference point at that point, which is common to understand that's not normal, that one of the options isn't hitting people to win an argument. And so at that point, it can be imitated by the child in adulthood. Also, alcoholism, substance abuse. If, for example, the father is alcoholic, the odds are high that, especially for boys, they will become alcoholic themselves as adults. Part of the reason for this is, according to theorist Bandura, Bandura, sorry, no I, 90% of learning is social. That means we learn through observation, and if our parents are acting violently and dysfunctionally, we imitate and copy that behavior. Community influence, most people think is about violence, but it's actually much more than that. Disorder, chaos, is a contributor to violence. If we don't have order, if we don't have organization, which is actually what I prefer to use the term, some hate groups use the term order is why. At any rate, authority figures monitoring, rules being held for people to be held accountable, things like this. The disorder can contribute to violence in the community as well. And we'll talk about that. Reported and unreported crime. There are two types of crime reports. The FBI, in common speak, Federal Bureau of Investigations, has a uniform crime report at www.fbi.gov, and the Bureau of Justice Statistics has the National Crime Victimization Survey, ojp.usdoj.gov. The UCR looks at only reports that are made by the police department and reported by actual law enforcement agencies. So if you were to call up ring ring the police department and say, my roommate stole my cell phone, what do you think would happen? They actually probably would not do much. The only way you get a police report is if there are documents that are readily available to you with an official police report number that you get. And because many of these crimes that are not serious, violent, life and death types of situations, because of limited manpower, funding, staff, and so on, the police can only do so many things. And so many things don't get reported officially to law enforcement, and that's called the dark figure of crime, just like it sounds. So many things are missing. Another reason for not reporting might be embarrassment, stigma, stereotypes, not wanting to look like a victimized person, or fear of retaliation and vengeance or threat of vengeance from the offender. Then later in 1972, we added the NCVS, National Crime Victimization Survey. It adds to, does not substitute, and it goes to the victims and interviews them for detailed accounts of their relationship with the offender, where they were, what time of day, and because it's detailed, it could suffer from false positive and false negative. So false positive and false negatives from your favorite classes in the world, research and statistics, if you remember and integrate all that knowledge across all your psychology classes and your GE classes into this class. To review, false positive means you overreport. So let's say your ex-boyfriend home invasion robbed you. You add that he also stole your laptop computer even though he didn't, right? False negative means, and this is actually very common, many people are raised to not make a fuss, to not bother people. And so maybe 5 victimizations of crime happen, but they only report 1 or 2. That's a underreporting, false negative. At any rate, it is available. Let me see if I can open it up on this website, which is really great, bjs.gov. You can look in the internal search engine or click the link in your handout. It also goes over types of crime. What's a hate crime? What's a property crime? Gang-related crime, identity theft, which is common in digital age, and so on. But that's not required. It's just helpful. There are different kinds of victimization according to opportunity and planning. Intentional means premeditated. They actually had a plan, a plot for certain targets. It might be an assassination of a president as a random example. Random victims are often people who might not even know who the offender is. They have no relationship personally or professionally. So you're standing in a post office line, and because you happen to be wearing something that indicates a religious group membership, they might shoot you, but you don't even know who the offender is. It's more random. Oops, sorry. Victims by circumstance, one example would be from the top 10 New York bestseller book authors. One book was called Freakonomics, and they had a follow-up called Freakonomics 2. The second book looked at prostitution with very high rates compared to many regions in 3 southern cities of Chicago. And they wanted to know why and what was happening. So they interviewed both the clients and the women who prostituted and asked what kind of victimization was frequent for violent crime. And everyone reported that it was physical assault from the customer. And what was interesting was the customers and the women who prostituted all admitted it had nothing to do with the prostitutes. The reason for being assaulted was not the prostitute's fault. Often it was impotence, meaning erectile dysfunction as psychological disorder professionals speak, because of job-related stress. So maybe they were getting fired or laid off, or their income was stressful. Not enough money was being made. And so they would have difficulty performing sexually, and because of the embarrassment, and some people described it as a safe target, because the woman felt like she was a safe target, they would actually hit or abuse physically the woman who was the prostitute. That's a circumstantial victimization. Victims as contributors, if you yourself are committing a violent crime, such as in a gang-related drug deal, and then something makes you victimized, that would be an example. Again, you can email me any questions you have or bring them up in class. Now we're going to talk about effects of violent crime. As you can see, it's hard to research situational or even reactionary violence and victimization because we can't predict it. It just happens in the moment. If someone comes in and you have to defend your home, you might use something to defend yourself as a reaction. Situationally, people do terrible things, such as road rage, which could be considered either situational or reactionary, depending on exactly what happened. Again, we can't predict that's going to happen to set up a research study to study it. Now we're going to talk about homicide. This is very important because this slide will open your eyes. Very eye-opening and taking away from the myths. It's a reality check is what I call it. Most homicides are intraracial. Murder rates between 1980 and 2008, 84% of white victims of murder were murdered by whites, and 93% of black victims of murder were murdered by blacks. Almost a quarter, 24% of gang-related murder were from children under the age of 18. And 2 out of 5 female murder victims were killed by their intimate partners, their romantic partners in 2008. Even more jarring and unsettling are medical and psychological commonly known facts. This has been researched and is commonly known in the professional fields for many, many decades. The number one cause of death of pregnant women across the USA is, any guesses? Any guesstimations? They are victimized in murder by their romantic partners or past partners. I repeat, they are murder victims, pregnant women. The number one cause of death of pregnant women is being killed. In the same year, 59% of young children who were victimized in murder were killed by their own parents. That's the majority. And if you're good at math, please add up these numbers in this um, bullet point. All these handouts are available online for every single chapter, which I mentioned in a previous video, which may or may not have survived the glitches. 10% of children who were murdered were victimized by their own family members. So that could be an uncle, a sibling, an older sister. 30% were murdered by a friend or acquaintance, such as a neighbor whose name they know. Now add them all up and what do you get? That means the vast majority of children who are killed by people that they know and probably trust. They know their names. This is very, very, very daunting. Very scary stuff. There's a myth that a stranger in a van will offer you candy and kidnap you and kill you. The research statistics as far as murder goes say from the Bureau of Justice Statistics in 2011, that's actually not what's going on. So, just as an introduction, it was kind of easy breezy. Because we're just starting, I would like you to look at some of these questions which we might cover in class. Do you think that currently in your community in the USA, violent crime is increasing or decreasing annually? And how does it differ between regions and cities? Which ones have higher rates of what? Demographically, which is a way of taxonomically classifying different features of humans. According to sex, gender, race, income level, what kind of violent crimes are higher or lower in rates, as well as the victimization rates, and what might be causing that. And this one is a great one to think about. What is misreporting of violent crime? We talked about it a little bit, but I would like to get your opinions on misreported violent crime. So we looked at individual influence, familial influence, community influence, including income and socioeconomic status, limited resources, and chaos or disorder. We also looked at Uniform Crime Report and National Crime Victimization Survey, 2 types of reporting of violent crime. To minimize the underreporting and overreporting in NCVS, we do follow-up interviews, and this minimizes the false reports. However, it is very expensive, very time-consuming, very staff-consuming to re-interview the same people, so it could take up to 5 years, for example, to do a follow-up interview for NCVS. I would like to mention how violent crime affects everyone and individuals in the whole community. One example might be that if we imprison a person of color and they're falsely imprisoned through false eyewitness testimony, if you've heard of Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, maybe that person wanted nothing more than to have a family of his own. That was his goal and priority in life, and he never got to get married. Instead, he was in prison for 55 years. He never got to have children, and maybe he was supposed to be the father of our next genius, our next Einstein. And we'll talk about biases according to research results and institutional reports, where people of color are falsely imprisoned more than any other group in terms of ethnicity, and how this affects our trust in our community and what we can do about it. I like to think that we all have a safety bubble. Each individual has a safety bubble. And so if we have a roommate or someone in college who exposes us to violent graphic detail unnecessarily, even showing us weapons more than once, this is actually an opportunity for us to learn about our own self-care, that we need better boundary setting and boundary maintenance to take care of our safety bubble, including hearing and seeing things that are unnecessarily graphic or detailed about violence and victimization. And I'm sure your parents have told you to not be exposed to violent media, and we'll talk about more of that in future chapters. When we see incidents of crime as psychologists, again, we take a biopsychosocial perspective. We like to look at what's going on in a holistic way. We don't think that just one thing make someone violent, and we will talk about this at great length with case studies, which will be fascinating, even serial killers and neuroscience researchers at UC Irvine. Alrighty, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me by email or mention them in class.